Democratic Club in Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? It's wonderful to be here. I see so many old friends in the audience, and I'm really enjoying myself. Thank you very much for giving me the honor of introducing Janet Wallach. I must tell you before I go through the particulars of Janet's distinguished career, that I have known Janet in quite another role that's going to be interesting to the Women's National Democratic Club. I really met Janet first through her husband. So for me, she was first the wife of John Wallach, a very distinguished newspaperman who started a wonderful organization to which I belong and contribute called Seeds of Peace. And Janet is a partner with her husband, John Wallach, in Seeds of Peace, a camp for children who come from Israel and all the countries of the Middle East, and they spend 3 weeks together in at a camp in Maine, and I've also visited the camp, and it has done a great deal to promote intergroup relations and familiarity of kids who are really from countries that have been at war with one another. That's the way I first know Janet. Now, of course, I know Janet as the distinguished author of this book, Desert Queen, which I bought in July, but couldn't read because of the campaign and now the inaugural. But when I realized the time was approaching for me to introduce Janet, I cracked the book last Thursday, and I haven't had a good night's sleep yet, and I finally finished it. I could not put it down. It is an enthralling book, especially for those who are interested in the politics of the Middle East, and which are so relevant to our politics today. It is truly an enthralling book about Gertrude Bell, this very complicated woman, and the tremendous impact that she made on the area of the Middle East. I would like very quickly to read a bit of Janet's resume, or her bio, I should say. She's been writing about the Middle East for the past 15 years and has contributed frequently to the Washington Post and other periodicals. And her stories have included profiles of Jahan Sadat, Queen Noor of Jordan, Saudi billionaire Adnan Khashoggi, we remember him, Palestinian ambassador Hassan Abu Rahman, and Iraqi ambassador Nizar Hadmoun. In 1987, in the midst of the Intifada, that is between Israel and its neighbors, the uprising of the Palestinians against the Israelis, Janet and her husband, journalist John Wallach, spent 6 months living in Jerusalem and traveling extensively through the West Bank and Gaza. Their research resulted in their first book together, Still Small Voices, a wonderful book that you all should read, and it's available in the bookstores. The stories of dozens of Israelis and Palestinians living in the occupied territories. They also co-authored 2 other books, The New Palestinians and Arafat in the Eyes of the Beholder, which I also recommend to you very highly if you have any interest in the Middle East and in the conflict and the struggle for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. They have recently completed updating their biography of Arafat, which will be published at the end of next month, and I look forward to reading that. Janet was co-host of Private Lives, Public People, a monthly interview show which aired on the Lifetime Network. It's a network TV station. She has made numerous appearances on CNN as well as other cable and network talk shows to discuss Middle East matters. She also works with her husband on my favorite organization, Seeds of Peace, a project he created and heads, which brings Arab and Israeli children together for a month in the United States. I am very pleased to introduce my friend and the great author of this wonderful book that I hope you all will read, Janet Wallach.
Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. Can you hear me? I must say that Sarah looks terrific in a Seeds of Peace t-shirt. And of course you all can too. As a matter of fact, our executive director, Bobby Gottschalk, is here today. And I want to thank her for being here and all of you for being here. It's wonderful to see you all. And David Evans of the British Council. All of you who have put together such a wonderful lunch today. I spoke here about 6 years ago, actually. And I do want to add that Sarah has done so much wonderful work towards peace in the Middle East that she is being honored at a dinner next week in New York, at a dinner with Shimon Peres, and Sarah is being awarded for the work that she has done. So I think she deserves a hand for that. It was about 6 years ago that I spoke here last, and it was after the publication of our book, Arafat in the Eyes of the Beholder. My husband and I, as Sarah mentioned, had written 3 books together, which I felt tested our marriage enough. And so I started a search for a book to write on my own, and I wanted to write about a woman, and I loved writing about the Middle East, but it was not easy to find the person who would combine all of the qualities that I was looking for. Many years ago, before my first trip to the Middle East, I had read some memoirs by a woman who had traveled around Syria at the turn of the century. And I was apprehensive about going to the Middle East in the 70s. There she was in 1902, 1903, traveling by herself, a British woman, on camel and horseback, having a wonderful old time. And I read some of her book and put it back on the shelf, forgot about her, but I did think, my God, she was brave, and what am I worried about? So that kind of stayed in the back of my mind. We finished the Arafat book just as the Gulf War began. And I started seeing references to Iraq, of course, and to a woman named Gertrude Bell, kind of blaming her in part for what was going on in the Middle East at the time, for what was happening in Iraq. And that sounded rather interesting to me. And as I read more about her, I realized that that was the same woman who had trekked around by herself at the turn of the century. And so I thought, aha, I think I have found just the right subject. Well, I did a lot more research just to make sure. I traveled to England and spent a good deal of time at the University of Newcastle, where her papers have all been deposited. And I traveled throughout the Middle East to Israel and to Egypt, to Jordan, to Syria, and even just 3 years ago to Iraq. And I discovered that she was truly a fascinating woman who had been one of the most powerful women in the world during her time. She was brilliant, she was bold, she was outspoken and outrageous. She dressed in feathery hats and fur coats and flowery dresses in the middle of the desert. She was so smart that really stood out in my mind. And in fact, she reminded me of a story that I've heard, and with apologies to some of you in the audience, because it is a slightly sexist story. She reminded me of a man who was walking in the desert and happened to kick some sand. And lo and behold, a genie appeared. And the genie said, "Aha, master, I am here to serve you. You have 3 wishes. What is your first wish?" And the man thought for a minute and said, "I would like to be twice as smart as I am now." And the genie said, "Your wish is my desire. You are twice as smart." "And what is your second wish, sire?" And the man said, "I'd like to be 5 times smarter than I am." And the genie said, "Okay, sire. Poof, you're 5 times smarter than you were." And what is your third wish? And think hard. Remember, this is your last wish. And the man thought and thought, and he said, I would like to be 10 times smarter than I am now. And the genie said, are you sure? And the man said, yes. And the genie said, okay. Poof, you're a woman. Well, that's a story that I don't think could have been told, actually, at the time of Gertrude Bell. She was born in 1868, in the time when the British Empire was at its greatest, when the British Navy ruled the seas, British merchants controlled the trade, British food and British clothing were provided for a quarter of the world's population. And the Bell family was very much a part of the British Empire. They were coal masters, prominent family, one of the wealthiest families in England. They lived up in Newcastle. And Gertrude's father was head of the Bell Brothers Iron Works. He was a man who was an industrialist. He was intellectually interested in what was going on. And he was an active member of, appropriately enough, the British Labour Party. In fact, he even ran for a seat in the Parliament. Gertrude's mother died when she was 3, and she was very close to her father, Hugh Bell. And Hugh's favorite motto was, obstacles are meant to be overcome. And in the course of her life, Gertrude Bell really tried to overcome just about every obstacle, and there were many that were put in her way. Beginning with education. She grew up at a time when girls were educated at home, and she was one of the very first women to attend Oxford University. And not only did she attend, she was the first to achieve the highest honors in her field, which was modern history. In the days when women who enjoyed sports would go boating or take long walks, Gertrude Bell liked to climb mountains. And not just any mountains. She liked to find ones that no one had climbed before. And so in the Swiss Engelhorn Mountains, there is today something called Gertrude's Peak. In a time when women who liked to go to the British Museum to look at archaeological ruins, Gertrude Bell traveled to the Middle East, not just to look at them, but to make her own discoveries. And indeed, she discovered the great palace of Uqadir in Iraq. And at a time when unmarried women had to travel with a chaperone or an escort around London, Gertrude Bell was out there in Syria and Iraq and Arabia, traveling by herself all through the area. And at a time when women who worked were writers or teachers, or perhaps during World War I were nurses, Gertrude Bell worked for the British government, worked as a spy during World War I. In a time when women would leave their calling cards at the houses of their friends, Gertrude Bell would drop in on the tents of the sheikhs. And not just to say hello, and not to visit the harem, which she wanted absolutely nothing to do with, but to sit in the tents with the sheikhs and to drink their coffee and share their bread and talk about the gossip of the desert and the politics of what was going on in the world of the Middle East. And then sometimes she would leave her calling card as she left. In the days when women would be pleased to be invited out to dine, Gertrude Bell was invited to attend the Paris Peace Conference to represent the British on the great Arab question. And 2 years later, she was invited by Winston Churchill to be the only woman to attend the Cairo Conference, which literally decided the fate of the modern Middle East. And in the days when women thought mostly about marriage, Gertrude Bell thought about it too, but more she thought about romance and she thought about her work. And in fact, after she had been such a success at Oxford, it was time for her to find a husband. And in those days, women had 3 seasons in which to be presented to society and in which to come home with at least a fiancé, and one hoped the husband himself. And so she was presented 3 times, and great a success as she was in school, she was a failure socially. Not knowing quite what to do about this, her parents decided to send her to Persia, where her uncle was the British ambassador. And so she set off at the age of 23 to visit her uncle, who was then the British envoy in Tehran. And she arrived there, and the whole embassy staff came out to visit, to see her, to greet her. And they gave her a wonderful welcome, and there were very interesting people in their midst. And one of them was particularly interesting. He was a young man, actually 10 years older than she, by the name of Henry Cadogan. And he paid great attention to her and took her around everywhere and showed her what there was to see. And she fell in love with Henry, and Henry with Gertrude, and by everything that was around her. She was roused by the sensuality of the East and seduced by the attentions of her suitor, handsome, 10 years older than she, and worldly. He read her the mysterious lines of the Persian poets and slipped his arms around her. He took her to strange sights, like the whitewashed Tower of Silence, where the Zoroastrians throw their dead, leaving them for birds to devour. And he held her tightly when she shivered in fear. He showed her hawking, and they watched together as the servants released quails into the sky and let loose the hawks to pounce on them. He brought her to a garden where they lay in the grass under trees, dangled their toes in a little stream, and kissed, then watched the lights changing on the snowy mountains. From his pocket, he pulled out a tiny volume of Catullus and read aloud the lyric pieces of the Roman poet. It was very delicious, she wrote home dreamily. A few days later, they spent an afternoon in a garden tent, and in between their kisses, they read the voluptuous quatrains of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. With me along the strip of herbage strewn that just divides the desert from the sown, where name of slave and sultan is forgot, and peace to Mahmud on his golden throne. A book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. So, wilderness were paradise enow. Well, it was paradise for Gertrude and Henry, and they spent several more months together and decided that they wanted to marry. And she wrote home to tell her family about him, and he wrote home to ask for her hand in marriage. And they waited for an answer, and they waited for an answer. And I won't tell you what happened after that. Except to say that several years later, Gertrude Bell had become a well-known author. She had written a book called The Desert and the Sown. The title, of course, was taken from that poem, about her travels through Syria and her experiences with the Arabs. And she had translated a book of poetry by the great Persian poet Hafiz. And she had made some important archaeological discoveries. And it was now a number of years later, and she was out again, traveling in the Middle East, traveling in the Syrian desert. She had been gone for 6 months, and she was tired and weary and lonesome and homesick. But she knew that a good friend of hers, Henry Cadogan, who was the head of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, was out there too, at Carchemish, in charge of a dig, an archaeological dig at a Hittite site. And she had been traveling right near that area. And as you know, of course, that area was all under the control of the Ottoman Turks. And although they were in control, the British had a great deal of influence, and so did some of the other European countries, namely France and Germany. And the British and the Germans were eyeing each other. This was in the, around 1909. And Gertrude had some good friends who were German archaeologists, and so she stopped off to see what they were doing at their dig. And of course, they were using the latest techniques for their work. And she was also watching what was going on in terms of politics, as all the British archaeologists were, and as the German archaeologists were. The Germans were keeping an eye on the British. The British were keeping an eye on the Germans because they were busy building the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, which was a key transit line, communications line in the Middle East at that time. And so after visiting the Germans, Gertrude went to see her friend David Hogarth in Carchemish. And just as she arrived, she learned that he had left. He had gone on holiday. But he had put two of his own assistants in charge. And so she went to see them. And she arrived as a woman with a great reputation. And there they were, these two young fellows who were a bit nervous about her arrival because the work that they had been doing had been just so-so. And they really didn't want her to find out. And so she saw them when they came to meet her. Campbell Thompson, Hogarth's assistant at the Ashmolean Museum, was a tall, quiet academic, soon to be married, who taught linguistics and enjoyed deciphering ancient codes. His junior colleague, Thomas Edward Lawrence, destined to be a myth-maker and a legend himself, was a 23-year-old graduate student with a specialty in medieval pottery. Looking him over, she saw a short fellow, strongly built, with yellow hair, intense blue eyes, a high forehead, and a straight nose. An eccentric dresser, fascinated by Oriental things, he favored a gray flannel blazer piped in pink, white flannel shorts, gray stockings, and red Arab slippers. Around his waist, he tied a bright red tasseled Arab belt, which marked him as a bachelor. Since he was obviously eligible, his cause had been taken up by the local villagers, who were eager to find him a wife. Hearing of Gertrude's pending arrival, they assumed she was coming to be his bride. Well, of course she wasn't, nor was he interested. But they did spend an interesting day, and in fact, as he showed her around, he and Thompson were a bit apologetic because they knew that the work that they had been doing hadn't been very good. And indeed, she looked at it and she said, after having seen the Germans and their high techniques, she looked at it and she declared it prehistoric. Later on in his own writings, Lawrence fessed up that they had really been hacking away at the earth and they hadn't much idea of what they had been doing. But just to protect themselves, Lawrence and Campbell Thompson spent the rest of the afternoon challenging Gertrude Bell on everything that she knew and everything that they knew about the Arabs in the Middle East, everything from ancient Arab coins to how to bargain for a camel. And by the end of the day, they were at least, well, shall we say, friends, if not, certainly not lovers. And later on, they would meet again and be allies. But she went home, back to England while he was there, and she did fall in love. She had met a fellow while she was traveling who was a British officer and a diplomat, and his name was Richard Doughty Wiley. Dick Doughty Wiley was strong and virile looking. He was an adventurer and a traveler. In fact, his uncle was a famous author and traveler, Doughty, who wrote a famous book called Arabia Deserta, the Desert of Arabia, of course. And she was fascinated by Doughty Wiley and fell madly in love with him. and he with her. And it was a wonderful romance, except for one major problem. He was married. But they did have their romance to a degree, until he announced, sadly, in 1913, that he was being posted in the Balkans. And off he went to help make peace, presumably, in the Balkans. And Gertrude Bell, wanting to show her own independence and wanting to pursue her own work, announced that she too was going off, that she was going to make a trip that she had yearned to make for many years, to penetrate the desert of Arabia. She had been warned many, many times not to do it. The Turks would not give her permission, and because of that, the British wouldn't either. It was a dangerous place to go. The Bedouins carried out great raids called ghazoos, where thousands of them on horseback would attack another tribe. There would be robbery, there could be rape, and there could be murder, and she could be caught in it. Or she could be just taken by desert robbers, or who knew what. No one was going to protect her. Everyone was against her doing it. But Gertrude Bell was nothing if not determined and intrepid. And so she decided to set out. It was the end of 1913. Gray clouds cloaked the sky as Gertrude set off to the east of Damascus, leaving behind the world of shops and friends and spoken English, riding away without permission from the Turks. It would take 3 months' time to reach Hayl, headquarters of the great Sheikh Ibn Rashid. From there, she hoped to visit Ibn Saud, inshallah, God willing. "I feel like an Arab sheikh," she wrote, with her caravan of 20 camels laden with goods, 3 camel drivers, her cook, her elderly guide, and her Rafiq, the paid escort Hamad. Sitting high on the camel's saddle, she held the loosely tied halter in her gloved hands and tapped the animal with a switch, sending it to the left or the right as she rode across miles of marshy land. Pockets of truffles lay underfoot. Wild fowl occasionally flew overhead. Wild boar rushed past, and an hour outside Dumir, the last outpost of civilization between Damascus and the Euphrates, she stopped to camp. "Content reigns in my camp," she wrote home, "and all goes smoothly." The following morning, they moved past the Black Hills onto the flat and yellow plain. But soon her men caught sight of rising smoke and a camel flock, signs of the Jebel Druze. Gertrude spotted a horseman galloping toward them, firing shots into the air. He wheeled his horse around them, shouting that they were foes and ordering them not to use their guns. With that, he aimed his rifle at Gertrude and demanded that Ali, her helper, hand over his rifle and his fur cloak. Within seconds, more of the tribesmen appeared. Terrified, Gertrude found herself surrounded by a dozen Druze, shrieking insanely, matted black hair flying in their faces as they leapt into the air, their bodies half naked except for one who wore no clothes at all. Shouting crazily, one of them grabbed Muhammad's camel, drew the sword hanging behind the saddle, and danced around the group, slashing the air and hitting Gertrude's camel on the neck to make it kneel. As the animal struggled to get up, Gertrude could only watch in silence while the thieves stripped her men of their revolvers, their cartridge belts, and their cloaks. A week out, and already her hopes were scorched. But things changed, and the caravan was soon on its way again. But her voyage carried heavier baggage now, the weight of ominous portents. It was a rough trip, and she was even taken prisoner in Hayl. But she made it, and she made it back, and when she returned, she went back to England. And just a short while after that, World War I broke out. And suddenly, the British officials who had condemned her traveling to Arabia were most eager to have all of her information about Arabia, because the war had come, the British were were eager to support an Arab revolt against the Turks, and they needed all of the information she had. She was the only European who had traveled to Arabia, that part of Arabia, in the past 20 years. She was the only one who knew where the water wells were and where the railway lines were and where the tribes gathered and who were the important sheikhs, who would be the friends of the British and who would be their foes. And so she was drafted as a spy into the Arab Bureau, the Military Intelligence Bureau in Cairo. And when she arrived there, lo and behold, there was Campbell Thompson, who was deciphering codes, and there was T.E. Lawrence. And it was he who was chosen, of course, to help be the liaison with the Arab revolt. But Lawrence had never been to Arabia. He had been to Syria, and he had been to Palestine. Only Gertrude had been to Arabia. So it was she who provided him with all of that necessary, that vital information about the Arabs that he needed to carry out his work with the Arab revolt. And so, in fact, it was Gertrude Bell who was really the brains behind Lawrence of Arabia. And when Lawrence went off to Arabia, Gertrude was sent to Baghdad. She was sent to Mesopotamia as the, funny title, Oriental Secretary, which indeed was a euphemism for intelligence agent. She was the eyes and ears of the British Empire in Baghdad. And after the war, when the British and the French convened the Paris Peace Conference, it was Gertrude Bell who was invited to attend there in 1919 to represent the British and the great question, the great Arab question. What do we do with this territory and with these people now that we have it? And of course, after the Paris Peace Conference, the French were given the mandates of Syria and the Lebanon, and Britain was given the mandates of Palestine and Mesopotamia. By 1920, there were uprisings all over the Middle East, and in 1921, there was a new colonial secretary appointed in London by the name of Winston Churchill. And he took one look at all of the problems, and he summoned his greatest Middle East experts to come to Cairo to discuss these problems. He invited 39 men and 1 woman, Gertrude Bell. And so she arrived in her fur coat and her feathery hats, and there she was in Cairo. And when it came time to discuss Mesopotamia, Churchill turned to her. She was the expert on the Arabs. And it was determined, she had actually been asked beforehand to draw the lines in the sand of the new country that would be created called Iraq. She had worked with the tribal leaders and with the sheikhs and actually drew the borders in the sand that we know today as the modern state of Iraq. And she was asked what people should be within those borders. And of course, there were the Shiites, the tribes in the south, and nomadic tribes throughout the country, the Shiites. There were the Sunnis, who were primarily townsmen. And then there was another group, the group that Churchill thought should be given their own area, but which Gertrude Bell thought should be incorporated into Iraq, and that was the Kurds. Why the Kurds? Well, they were not ethnic Arabs, but they were Sunni Muslims. And together with the Sunnis in the town, they constituted a majority. And Gertrude Bell knew that without them, the country would have a Shiite majority. And even in those days, in 1921, the Shiites were demanding an Islamic republic. And she was wary of this. She was looking for a pro-Western, more secular kind of state, and that's why she supported the idea of a Sunni majority, which included the Kurds. And last but not least, of course, was who would rule this country, who would run it. They knew it would be a monarchy, but who would be the man? And Gertrude and Lawrence together insisted that it be Faisal. Faisal, who was the son of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the man whom the British had supported in the Arab revolt. Faisal, who had been the great leader in the Arab revolt, the great warrior and the great unifier of the Arab tribes. And so it was Faisal who was chosen, and it was Gertrude Bell who became his closest personal and political advisor. And in those years after the World War I, Gertrude Bell was indeed the most powerful woman in the British Empire. So for me, it was a fascinating 5 years to spend studying her, researching all of this, and I really came away feeling that she was an extraordinary woman, a woman who had indeed conquered almost every obstacle that was put in her path, a woman who became a role model not just for women, but for men and women who want to go out and try and do things that no one has ever done before. And she was a woman who truly made her mark on history. And so I thank you all for allowing me to speak and for listening to me, and I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope that you have some questions to ask about Gertrude Bell.